Hey guys, it's easy to imagine empires collapsing because an enemy army breaks through the walls. But sometimes, the most dangerous invasion arrives quietly, packed in wooden chests, insured like ordinary cargo, and sold as if it were just another commodity. In 19th century China, one of the world's largest and most confident states discovered that the threat it couldn't blockade, tax, or politely regulate was a trade that turned prosperity into dependency. And the strangest part is that, on paper, the Qing Empire looked almost unbreakable until it wasn't. If you enjoy calm, long-form history that takes its time and tries to make the past feel understandable, consider subscribing. It helps more curious listeners find these deeper dives, and it means you won't miss the next documentary when we explore another story where small decisions add up to enormous change. To understand how the opium trade helped shatter China's greatest empire, we have to begin with what the Qing believed about the world, and what the world began to believe about the Qing. By the late 18th century, the Qing dynasty ruled a vast, multi-ethnic realm that stretched from the Pacific coast deep into Central Asia. Its population was immense, its agricultural base productive, and its bureaucracy, while imperfect, had a long tradition of governing through exams, paperwork, and a moral language of order and harmony. To many within the empire, the Qing system did not feel like a temporary arrangement. It felt like the natural shape of civilization. Foreign powers were expected to come as supplicants, bearing tribute, acknowledging the superiority of the emperor's mandate, and accepting the rules of access to Chinese markets. But beyond China's borders, another system was hardening into place. An industrializing, finance-driven global economy that treated trade as leverage and markets as strategic terrain. European consumers developed a deep appetite for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, and European states became accustomed to the wealth these imports signaled. The problem, from the European perspective, was that China demanded payment in silver and had little interest in buying European-manufactured goods on the same scale. This created a persistent trade imbalance, an outflow of silver that worried merchants and officials alike. It wasn't merely an accounting issue. In a world where war, empire, and credit were increasingly connected, a steady drain of precious metal looked like weakness. The British East India Company, and the wider British trading world that orbited around it, found an answer in a product that China officially forbade, but that could be sold at extraordinary profit. Opium, produced largely in British-controlled India, processed and shipped through a network of merchants, middlemen, and coastal smugglers, opium offered something that tea did not. It was not merely desired, it was addictive. That distinction matters because it changed the relationship between buyer and seller. It created repeat demand, expanding markets, and a predictable stream of silver flowing back out of China. In the logic of the trade, opium was a solution to imbalance. In the lived reality of the Qing Empire, it became a corrosive force that eroded households, communities, and, eventually, the state itself. It's important to pause on a point that often gets flattened in retellings. Opium was not unknown in China. It had medicinal uses, and forms of consumption existed before the 19th century. What changed was scale and intensity. The volumes imported through coastal networks grew dramatically, and the social reach widened. Where the Qing might once have contained a vice within certain circles, the new opium economy expanded across classes and regions, drawing in consumers, corrupting local enforcement, and creating a chain of profit that was difficult to break. Smugglers paid bribes. Officials looked away. Coastal communities became dependent on the flow of foreign goods and silver. Even people who despised the trade could be pulled into it, because the money it generated was real, immediate, and hard to replace. Inside the Qing court, opium became more than a moral concern. It was a fiscal and administrative crisis. Silver was the bloodstream of the empire's tax system. Many taxes were assessed in silver, and officials relied on predictable flows to fund granaries, river works, salaries, and disaster relief. When silver began to leave the country in large quantities to pay for opium, it didn't simply make China poorer in an abstract sense. It distorted prices. It made it harder for ordinary people to meet tax obligations. It encouraged harsher local extraction. It amplified resentment toward officials who seemed unable to maintain fairness. And it undermined confidence in the Qing promise that the emperor's government could protect the people from chaos. At the same time, the Qing state faced a dilemma that would be familiar to any government confronted by a powerful black market. Enforcement could be costly and politically risky, but inaction could be fatal. To crack down seriously on opium meant challenging networks that already involved local elites, merchants, and sometimes officials themselves. It meant disrupting coastal economies and provoking foreign traders who had become accustomed to operating in the gray zone between legality and profit. But toleration or partial enforcement created its own spiral. The more the trade grew, the more normal it became, and the harder it was to reverse without an even larger shock. That shock arrived with the figure most associated with the Qing crackdown, Lin Zexu. Lin was not merely a bureaucrat. He was a representative of a certain Qing ideal, the scholar official who believed moral governance could shape society. In 1839, he was sent to Canton, the major point of regulated foreign trade, with orders to stop the opium traffic decisively. Lin moved with unusual determination. He pressured foreign merchants to surrender their opium stocks, tightened coastal enforcement, and framed the issue not as a negotiation over trade terms, but as a question of law and sovereignty. To the Qing, the logic was simple. Opium was illegal, it damaged the population, and the state had the right, indeed the duty, to suppress it. From the perspective of many British commercial interests, the same actions looked like an assault on property and on the freedom of trade as they understood it. This is where two incompatible worldviews collided. The Qing still assumed that foreign merchants operated by imperial permission. British officials increasingly assumed that commerce should be protected by state power, including naval power, when profits or principles were threatened. When Lin confiscated and destroyed large quantities of opium, he did not see himself provoking a war. He saw himself enforcing the law. But in the new imperial economy, trade disputes could be translated into military disputes with remarkable speed. The first Opium War that followed was, in many ways, a demonstration of industrial-era coercion. British naval forces, equipped with steam power, modern artillery, and flexible logistics, could strike along China's coast and rivers in ways that exposed Qing weaknesses. The Qing military was not uniformly incompetent, but it was not prepared for this kind of conflict. The empire's defenses had been built for different threats: internal rebellion, frontier warfare, and coastal piracy, not sustained confrontation with a maritime power that could choose the time and place of battle. The result was not simply defeat, but humiliation, because it punctured the Qing belief that China's size and prestige were protection enough. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 marked a turning point. It forced China to open additional ports to foreign trade, pay indemnities, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. Just as significant was what treaties like this represented: a new relationship in which foreign powers could use force to reshape China's legal and economic landscape. These were not equal agreements negotiated between peers. They were imposed under pressure, and they became templates for further demands. In the years that followed, other states sought similar privileges. The Qing found itself managing not one foreign presence but many, each with its own merchants, missionaries, gunboats, and diplomatic agendas. And still, opium remained central. Even when legal status shifted and enforcement waxed and waned, the underlying reality persisted. The trade had created deep dependencies and deep resentments. It also created a political vocabulary that would echo for generations. For many Chinese intellectuals and officials, opium came to symbolize a broader pattern of humiliation and exploitation. It was not just a drug. It was proof that foreign powers could profit from China's weakness, and that the Qing state could not prevent it. The Second Opium War in the 1850s and 1860s further widened the breach. Again, disputes over trade, diplomacy, and legal jurisdiction escalated into conflict. Again, Qing military limitations were exposed. And again, the resulting treaties expanded foreign rights and access. The cumulative effect was to carve the empire's sovereignty into pieces, not always through outright colonization, but through ports, concessions, extraterritorial legal systems, and economic privileges that placed foreign actors beyond normal Qing control. For an empire built on the idea of a single moral and administrative order, this fragmentation was profoundly destabilizing. Yet the opium trade did not destroy the Qing alone. It acted more like an accelerant poured onto an already dry landscape. While foreign pressure increased, internal strains grew severe. Population growth strained land resources in many regions. Administrative corruption worsened in some areas, partly because low official salaries encouraged informal extraction, and partly because the sheer scale of the empire made oversight difficult. Natural disasters could still trigger migration and unrest, and as silver flows shifted, the tax system became more brittle. Under these conditions, large-scale rebellion became more likely, and in the mid-19th century, rebellion arrived with extraordinary force. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest civil conflicts of the century, erupted in the 1850s. Even without dwelling on graphic details, it's hard to overstate the scale of the disruption. Vast territories changed hands, cities were besieged, economies shattered, and Qing legitimacy was challenged not by a foreign army but by an internal alternative vision of order. The Qing eventually survived, but survival came at a price. The dynasty relied increasingly on regional armies and powerful local leaders, which helped defeat rebels but weakened central authority. The state that emerged was less cohesive, more indebted, and more vulnerable to both internal fracture and external manipulation. From a distance, it can be tempting to treat the opium story as a moral parable. A wicked trade, a helpless victim, a clear villain. The reality is more instructive and more unsettling. The trade expanded because it fit the incentives of a global economy that rewarded profitable coercion. It took root because enforcement was compromised by corruption and local dependency. It became catastrophic because it intersected with financial fragility, technological imbalance, and political rigidity. In other words, it wasn't just opium. It was a system of pressures that exposed how quickly a confident empire could be pulled into a new world order it did not choose. By the late 19th century, the Qing tried to adapt through what is often called the self-strengthening movement, efforts to import Western technology, build arsenals, modernize navies, and reform certain institutions without dismantling the Confucian moral core of the state. Some reforms achieved real gains, but modernization was uneven, contested, and often constrained by court politics. Meanwhile, foreign powers kept pushing. Japan's rise added a new dynamic. A neighboring state that modernized rapidly and then defeated Qing China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95, revealing again that the Qing could not rely on scale alone. The pattern of concessions deepened. The sense of national crisis intensified. When the Qing finally fell in 1911, it was not because one shipment of opium arrived or one battle was lost. It fell because legitimacy had drained away over decades, through repeated humiliations, internal wars, fiscal strain, and the growing belief among reformers and revolutionaries that the old order could not protect China in a modern imperial world. And yet, the opium trade remains one of the clearest threads connecting these transformations, because it shows how economics can become geopolitics, and how private profit can reshape the fate of states. So when people say the opium trade destroyed China's greatest empire, what they're really pointing to is a chain reaction. A trade imbalance encouraged a predatory solution. A predatory solution weakened the social fabric and the tax system. Enforcement produced international conflict. Conflict produced unequal treaties. Unequal treaties weakened sovereignty. Weakened sovereignty fed internal rebellion and reform crises. Over time, the Qing did not simply lose wars. It lost the ability to define the rules of its own survival. And that, more than any single battle, is what finally breaks an empire. The consequences of the Opium Wars did not end with treaty signatures or indemnity payments. They reshaped the internal balance of power within the Qing state in ways that were subtle at first, but ultimately transformative. When Beijing was forced to accept foreign diplomatic missions, open additional treaty ports, and grant extraterritorial rights, it was not just conceding territory or revenue. It was accepting that parts of its own soil would operate under foreign legal systems. In cities like Shanghai, entire districts functioned under rules beyond Qing jurisdiction. Foreign merchants, missionaries, and administrators gained space to act independently of Chinese courts. For a dynasty that defined order as unified and hierarchical, this fragmentation was deeply destabilizing. At the same time, opium consumption continued to spread. Even when efforts were made to regulate or tax it, the social cost lingered. Addiction reduced productivity in some communities and drained household resources. The moral language of the Qing state, built on discipline, responsibility, and social harmony, began to feel hollow to critics who saw corruption and weakness at the highest levels. Reform-minded officials increasingly argued that the problem was not simply foreign pressure, but structural stagnation. They questioned whether the old examination system, focused on classical texts, prepared administrators for a world of steamships, telegraphs, and industrial weaponry. The self-strengthening movement attempted to bridge that gap. Arsenals were constructed. Shipyards were established. Students were sent abroad. There were real achievements. Modern rifles, improved naval vessels, limited industrial ventures. But these reforms often existed alongside traditional institutions rather than replacing them. Decision-making remained divided between conservative court factions and pragmatic regional leaders. Funding was inconsistent, and crucially, modernization was often treated as a technical matter, machines and weapons, rather than a deeper transformation of governance, education, and political participation. Meanwhile, the memory of the Opium Wars hardened into a broader narrative of national humiliation. Intellectuals began to write about China's century of humiliation, a period in which foreign powers dictated terms, seized concessions, and imposed unequal agreements. Opium became a symbol within that story. It represented how economic dependence could be weaponized. It represented how moral outrage alone could not protect sovereignty. And it represented how the Qing court's slow response to global change had real consequences for millions of people. By the early 20th century, reform had turned into revolution. The 1911 revolution that toppled the Qing dynasty was driven by a complex mix of regional grievances, military mutinies, and ideological movements. But the dynasty's loss of credibility had roots stretching back to the first clashes over opium. When the Qing failed to prevent the trade, failed to win the wars that followed, and failed to restore full sovereignty, it signaled to many that the mandate of heaven, the moral right to rule, had weakened. In Chinese political culture, that perception mattered as much as any battlefield outcome. In the end, the opium trade did not single-handedly topple China's greatest empire, but it exposed its vulnerabilities at a critical moment in global history. It connected local addiction to global finance, domestic law to international gunboat diplomacy, and moral governance to industrial-era warfare. It showed that even a vast and sophisticated state could be undermined by a commodity when that commodity was backed by naval power and profit-driven networks. And it demonstrated that in the 19th century, control of trade routes and markets could be just as decisive as control of armies. The story is not simply about decline. It is also about transformation. Out of the Qing collapse emerged new debates about modernization, sovereignty, and national identity, debates that would shape China throughout the 20th century and beyond. The opium trade became a lesson etched deeply into political memory, that economic imbalance can invite coercion, that technological gaps can widen quickly, and that reform delayed can become reform denied. When we look back calmly at this period, what stands out is not inevitability, but contingency. Different policies, different timings, different global alignments might have altered the pace or character of events. Yet the structural forces were powerful. Industrial expansion in Europe, imperial competition, and China's own demographic and administrative pressures converged in ways that made confrontation likely. The opium trade was the spark that illuminated those tensions. And so the fall of the Qing reminds us of something enduring. Empires rarely collapse because of a single blow. They erode when external pressures and internal weaknesses reinforce each other over time. In 19th century China, opium was not just a substance. It was a catalyst linking commerce to conflict and conflict to collapse. Even after the Qing dynasty had fallen, the shadow of the opium trade did not disappear. The networks that had once operated under foreign protection did not simply dissolve overnight. In the early Republican period, warlords, fragmented authorities, and competing governments struggled to assert control over territory and revenue. In some regions, opium cultivation and distribution became a source of funding for local armies. What had begun as a foreign-imposed trade imbalance evolved into a domestic political problem, entangling reform, revenue, and regional power struggles. This lingering presence is important because it shows that the damage was not only military or diplomatic. It was institutional. The Qing collapse left behind weakened fiscal systems and contested sovereignty. When a state loses control over taxation and enforcement, informal economies tend to fill the gap. Opium, already deeply embedded in certain regions, was one of the commodities that could move quickly through these gaps. Efforts to suppress it were often sincere, but inconsistent. Without a strong central authority, prohibition campaigns could succeed in one province and fail in another. Internationally, the legacy of the Opium Wars continued to shape China's diplomatic posture. Chinese reformers and revolutionaries alike were acutely aware that the treaties imposed in the 19th century had placed the country in a subordinate position. Extraterritorial courts, foreign concessions, and tariff restrictions were reminders that sovereignty had been compromised. Campaigns to abolish unequal treaties became central to nationalist movements. In this sense, the opium trade had helped generate a political awakening. It forced a reckoning with global power structures and inspired calls for modernization, unity, and industrial strength. For Western audiences today, it can be tempting to interpret the Opium Wars solely through the lens of moral condemnation or geopolitical rivalry. But for China, the episode became part of a foundational national narrative. School textbooks, speeches, and public commemorations have often pointed back to this era as a warning about complacency and division. The memory of foreign gunboats enforcing commercial rights over domestic law remains a powerful image. It underscores how economic leverage can translate into political influence when technological gaps are wide. At the same time, historians increasingly emphasize complexity. The Qing dynasty was not passive or unaware. It debated policy vigorously. Officials disagreed over legalization versus prohibition, accommodation versus confrontation. Some argued that legalizing and taxing opium might reduce smuggling and stabilize revenue. Others insisted that moral authority required absolute suppression. These debates reveal a government wrestling with modern dilemmas: public health, fiscal necessity, and foreign pressure intersecting in uncomfortable ways. The tragedy is not that the Qing failed to think, but that its options were constrained by both internal limits and external force. If we step back, the broader lesson is about systems under stress. The 19th century was an era when industrial power could project itself globally at unprecedented speed. Steamships shortened distances. Modern artillery reshaped naval warfare. Financial networks linked distant markets. States that adapted quickly gained leverage. States that relied on older assumptions about hierarchy and tribute faced unexpected vulnerability. The Qing experience illustrates what happens when global integration is forced rather than negotiated on equal terms. And yet, out of that crisis emerged resilience. The 20th century would see China undergo revolution, civil war, foreign invasion, and radical transformation. But it would also see the reassertion of sovereignty and the rebuilding of state capacity. The long arc from the Opium Wars to the present includes periods of fragmentation and recovery, weakness and strength. Understanding how the opium trade destabilized the Qing helps clarify why later generations were so determined to avoid similar dependency. So when we reflect on how the opium trade helped destroy China's greatest empire, we are really tracing the intersection of commerce, addiction, technology, and imperial ambition. It was a story of ships and silver, of policy debates and battlefield defeats, of local suffering and global calculation. It reminds us that economic tools can be as disruptive as armies, and that the consequences of trade policies can echo for decades. In quiet moments of historical reflection, the fall of the Qing feels less like a sudden collapse and more like a gradual unraveling. Threads loosened one by one. Fiscal stability, military credibility, administrative cohesion, public confidence. Opium did not cut the fabric alone, but it weakened it at critical points. And once weakened, the empire struggled to withstand the storms of a rapidly changing world. There is also a deeper economic dimension to this story that often goes unnoticed. Before the surge of opium imports, the Qing economy had been remarkably self-sufficient. Agricultural productivity supported a vast population, internal trade networks connected distant provinces, and regional specialization allowed markets to function with relative stability. Silver flowed into China for generations because foreign demand for tea and other goods was so strong. In that environment, the empire could afford to be selective about what it allowed in return. It did not feel dependent on external markets in the way many smaller states did. The opium trade reversed that psychological balance. When silver began to flow outward in large quantities, it signaled something more than monetary loss. It suggested that the Qing were no longer setting the terms of exchange. The empire's earlier confidence had rested on the assumption that China was the central hub of civilization and commerce in East Asia. Now, external actors were exploiting internal demand to extract wealth systematically. Over time, this altered how Chinese elites perceived the outside world. Curiosity gave way to anxiety. Superiority gave way to defensive reform. Another layer of complexity lies in the rural economy. As silver became scarcer in certain regions, local markets tightened. Tax burdens, assessed in silver, could become heavier in real terms when supply fluctuated. Farmers who struggled to meet obligations sometimes borrowed at high interest, increasing vulnerability. Economic stress did not automatically produce rebellion, but it created conditions where grievances could spread more easily. When uprisings did erupt, such as the Taiping movement, they did so in a society already strained by demographic pressure and fiscal instability. Foreign powers, for their part, were not acting randomly. Britain's promotion of the opium trade was closely tied to its imperial structure in India. Revenues from Indian opium helped finance colonial administration and balanced accounts tied to tea imports. In this sense, China's crisis was connected to a much larger imperial system spanning continents. Decisions made in London and Calcutta reverberated in Canton and Beijing. The Qing court was not simply facing a bilateral dispute. It was confronting the outward expansion of a global empire that linked agriculture, finance, shipping, and military force into one coordinated network. It is worth noting that moral debates about opium also existed in Britain and elsewhere. Missionaries, reformers, and some politicians criticized the trade, arguing that it was unethical to profit from addiction. Parliamentary discussions occasionally reflected discomfort with the policy. Yet, economic incentives and strategic considerations often prevailed. This tension reminds us that historical actors rarely move in perfect moral alignment. Empires, like individuals, justify actions through a mix of principle and pragmatism. By the late 19th century, anti-opium movements gained more traction internationally. Efforts to regulate narcotics eventually led to early global drug control agreements in the 20th century. Ironically, one of the first international issues to generate coordinated regulation was a trade that had once been defended as legitimate commerce. The transformation from profitable commodity to controlled substance illustrates how norms evolve alongside political power. For China, however, the psychological impact endured long after international opinion shifted. The memory of the Opium Wars and unequal treaties shaped diplomatic priorities well into the 20th century. Restoring tariff autonomy, ending extraterritoriality, and renegotiating concessions became symbols of regained dignity. When these goals were gradually achieved in later decades, they were framed not just as policy victories, but as corrections to a historical injustice that began with forced trade. Looking calmly at the broader arc, the opium trade did not simply destroy an empire. It marked the beginning of China's forced integration into a new global order. That integration was uneven and painful. It exposed technological gaps and administrative rigidity. It sparked reform movements and revolutionary thought. It altered how Chinese leaders understood sovereignty and economic vulnerability. In that sense, the destruction of the Qing was also the birth of modern Chinese political consciousness. History rarely offers simple villains or single causes. The Qing dynasty faced environmental pressures, demographic expansion, internal corruption, and ideological ferment. But the opium trade stands out because it connected these internal strains to external coercion. It demonstrated how a commodity could become a weapon, how profit could override diplomacy, and how an empire's greatest strengths, its size, its traditions, its confidence, could become weaknesses when adaptation lagged behind change. And so, when we consider how the opium trade helped dismantle China's greatest empire, we see more than a chapter of 19th century conflict. We see a turning point in global history when industrial power and imperial ambition reshaped the balance between East and West. We see how economic imbalance can invite intervention. And we see how the consequences of trade decisions can ripple outward, reshaping nations for generations to come. As we move toward the closing reflections of this story, it helps to return to the question at the heart of it. Why did the opium trade prove so destructive to the Qing Empire at precisely that moment in history? After all, powerful states have endured harmful trades, financial crises, and even military defeats before. What made this episode different was timing. The Qing confronted the opium crisis during a global transition from agrarian empires to industrial powers. The pace of technological change was accelerating, and the gap between states that industrialized early and those that did not was widening rapidly. When British steam-powered gunboats sailed along China's coast, they represented more than superior naval engineering. They embodied a new relationship between industry and warfare. Industrial capacity allowed for mass production of weapons, faster logistics, and sustained overseas campaigns. The Qing military system, rooted in earlier centuries, had not evolved at the same speed. This asymmetry meant that conflicts sparked by trade disputes could escalate quickly into demonstrations of overwhelming force. The opium trade triggered confrontation, but industrialization determined its outcome. There is also a psychological dimension worth considering. For centuries, the Qing state had governed through a Confucian framework that emphasized moral authority, hierarchy, and ritual order. Foreign relations operated within a tribute system that reinforced symbolic superiority. When Western powers refused to fit into that framework and instead demanded diplomatic equality backed by force, the Qing court faced a conceptual challenge as well as a strategic one. Accepting equal diplomatic status meant revising long-held assumptions about China's place in the world. Resisting meant risking further war. The opium issue forced this confrontation earlier and more abruptly than gradual trade expansion might have done. Domestically, the crisis revealed structural weaknesses that had been manageable in calmer times. The imperial bureaucracy was vast, but not always efficient. Communication across distant provinces was slow. Corruption, while not unique to the Qing, undermined consistent enforcement of bans. When central authority demanded strict suppression of opium, local realities often diluted those orders. Smuggling thrived in the space between law and practice. This gap between policy and implementation weakened public confidence, particularly when foreign victories made enforcement appear both ineffective and costly. It is equally important to remember that the Qing dynasty did not collapse immediately after the Opium Wars. It endured for nearly 7 more decades. This endurance demonstrates that the empire retained considerable resilience. Regional leaders reorganized military forces. Reformers experimented with new schools and industries. Diplomatic missions sought to learn from foreign powers. The dynasty's fall in 1911 was the result of cumulative strain rather than sudden implosion. Yet the opium crisis marked the beginning of a period in which the Qing were more often reacting than shaping events. For many later Chinese thinkers, the lesson drawn from this period was clear. Sovereignty required modernization. Economic independence required industrial capacity. Military security required technological parity. Whether under nationalist or later revolutionary leadership, 20th century governments treated these goals as urgent precisely because of the 19th century experience. The humiliation associated with opium and unequal treaties became a motivating force behind efforts to centralize authority and rebuild national strength. From a broader global perspective, the story illustrates how interconnected the 19th century had become. Agricultural production in India, consumer demand in Britain, silver flows in China, and naval strategy in London were all linked. Decisions made in one part of the empire reverberated across oceans. The opium trade was not an isolated vice. It was embedded in a world economy driven by competition and expansion. Understanding this interconnectedness helps explain why the crisis escalated so dramatically. It was never just about one port city or one confiscated shipment. It was about competing visions of trade, law, and power in a rapidly integrating world. In the end, the destruction of China's greatest empire cannot be attributed to a single cause. But the opium trade stands as a powerful symbol of how economic imbalance, technological disparity, and political rigidity can intersect. It exposed the Qing to external coercion at a moment when internal reform was incomplete. It strained finances, challenged sovereignty, and fueled social tension. Over time, those pressures compounded. History often moves quietly before it moves visibly. Long before the Qing throne was abandoned, the foundations had shifted. The silver imbalance, the treaty ports, the foreign concessions, the regional armies, each represented a gradual adjustment away from centralized imperial confidence. The opium trade was one of the earliest and clearest signals that the old equilibrium had broken. And once that equilibrium was gone, restoring it proved far more difficult than anyone in the 18th century could have imagined. As we bring this long arc into sharper focus, one final perspective is worth considering. The fall of the Qing was not simply the end of a dynasty, but the end of a worldview that had endured for centuries. The empire had been built on the assumption that stability flowed from moral order, agricultural strength, and a hierarchical international system in which China stood at the center. The opium trade challenged each of those pillars at once. Morally, it undermined confidence in governance. When addiction spread and enforcement faltered, the state appeared unable to protect its own population. Economically, the steady outflow of silver destabilized fiscal planning and strained rural communities. Internationally, foreign powers no longer accepted symbolic hierarchy. They demanded treaty rights enforced by modern weaponry. The Qing court was forced into a reactive posture, negotiating from weakness rather than authority. Over time, this reactive stance reshaped elite thinking. Reformers increasingly argued that preserving tradition without structural change was no longer viable. The examination system, which had once ensured a meritocratic bureaucracy grounded in classical knowledge, came under criticism for failing to produce officials trained in science, engineering, or international law. Coastal defeats revealed gaps in naval modernization. Indemnities exposed fiscal limitations. Each crisis pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion: adaptation could not be partial. And yet, adaptation is rarely smooth in long-established systems. Court politics slowed reform. Conservative factions feared that rapid westernization would erode cultural identity. Regional leaders pursued modernization unevenly, creating pockets of progress but not a unified transformation. The Qing dynasty found itself balancing between preservation and reinvention, never fully committing to either. In that tension, momentum gradually shifted toward revolutionary change. The symbolism of opium persisted throughout these debates. It was cited in speeches, essays, and reform proposals as evidence of what happened when China lacked leverage in global trade. It represented vulnerability exploited. Even when domestic production later expanded, the memory of foreign-imposed dependency remained vivid. In this way, opium became more than a substance or a trade good. It became a historical reference point, shaping how future generations interpreted sovereignty and modernization. When the dynasty finally collapsed in 1911, it did so amid a mix of military mutiny, provincial declarations of independence, and ideological movements advocating republicanism. The last emperor's abdication marked the formal end of imperial rule, but the forces that led there had been gathering for decades. The Opium Wars were among the earliest shocks that set this trajectory in motion. They revealed that the Qing state could be compelled by external powers, and that internal cohesion could fracture under sustained strain. For audiences today, especially in countries once central to the opium trade, this history offers a moment of reflection. It reminds us that economic policies are never isolated from human consequences. Commodities carry political weight. Trade routes can become channels of influence, and technological advantage, when paired with commercial ambition, can reshape entire regions. At the same time, the story cautions against oversimplification. The Qing Empire was neither purely victim nor purely stagnant. It was a complex state navigating unprecedented change. The opium trade accelerated its challenges, but it also forced conversations about reform that might otherwise have unfolded more slowly. Out of crisis emerged new political identities, new intellectual movements, and ultimately new forms of governance. In quiet hindsight, the destruction of China's greatest empire appears less like a sudden collapse and more like a prolonged transformation under pressure. Opium was one of the first pressures to reveal the cracks. It linked domestic fragility to global ambition and showed how deeply interconnected the 19th century world had become. By tracing that connection carefully, we gain not only a clearer understanding of the Qing fall, but also a broader insight into how empires, no matter how vast, can be reshaped by forces that begin as trade and end as history. If we step back even further, beyond the sequence of wars and treaties, the opium crisis forces us to reconsider how we define strength in an empire. In the 18th century, Qing China possessed many indicators of power, territorial expansion, demographic scale, agricultural productivity, and administrative sophistication. By conventional standards of the early modern world, it was formidable. Yet the 19th century introduced a new measure of strength, industrial and maritime capability linked to global finance. In that arena, the balance shifted. The British ability to project naval force thousands of miles from home was inseparable from industrial shipbuilding, coal supply networks, and financial institutions capable of underwriting distant campaigns. Opium was profitable, but profit alone did not destroy the Qing. It was profit reinforced by gunboats and credit systems that allowed losses to be absorbed and campaigns sustained. The Qing state, by contrast, relied on agrarian taxation and traditional military structures. Its fiscal base was wide but not easily converted into rapid industrial modernization. This difference magnified every confrontation. Another dimension of the story lies in information. Industrial powers increasingly relied on faster communication, steam transport, improved printing, and eventually telegraphy, to coordinate policy and respond to crises. The Qing bureaucracy, though vast and literate, operated within older rhythms. Reports traveled by courier. Decisions required layered consultation. In moments of sudden escalation, this slower administrative tempo could become a liability. When Lin Zexu enforced the ban in Canton, he acted decisively within Qing logic. But the global response unfolded with a speed and scale that traditional diplomatic assumptions had not fully anticipated. Culturally, the shock of defeat reverberated through literature, scholarship, and political thought. Intellectuals began to question the long-standing belief that moral cultivation alone guaranteed political order. Exposure to Western science and political theory widened horizons. Translation societies emerged. Newspapers circulated reformist ideas. While these currents developed gradually, they were catalyzed by the recognition that isolation was no longer sustainable. Opium had forced the gates open. Ideas followed goods. It is also worth acknowledging the human scale of the crisis. Beyond policy debates and naval engagements were ordinary households adjusting to new economic realities. Farmers contended with shifting silver supplies. Urban families navigated new commercial environments in treaty ports. Some individuals profited from expanded trade. Others suffered from addiction or economic displacement. The transformation of coastal cities like Shanghai illustrates this duality. Foreign concessions fostered rapid commercial growth and infrastructure development, even as they symbolized compromised sovereignty. Modern banks and warehouses stood alongside reminders of unequal treaties. Over time, these contradictions shaped China's path into the 20th century. industrialization and reform became intertwined with nationalism. Leaders who sought modernization often framed it as a way to prevent a repetition of the opium era. Economic independence, tariff control, and domestic industry were not abstract goals. They were responses to lived historical experience. The narrative of humiliation became a tool for mobilization, encouraging unity in the face of external pressure. And so, when historians describe the opium trade as having destroyed China's greatest empire, they are pointing to more than battlefield defeats. They are describing a chain of structural shifts. A trade imbalance invited coercive correction. Coercion exposed military weakness. Military weakness eroded diplomatic leverage. Eroded leverage strained fiscal systems and encouraged internal unrest. Over decades, these pressures converged. The Qing did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It was gradually overtaken by a world that had changed faster than its institutions. In the quiet tone of historical reflection, the lesson is not simply about blame. It is about adaptation. Empires survive when they recognize structural change early and respond decisively. They falter when confidence delays reform. The Qing dynasty's encounter with the opium trade illustrates how economic forces, once entangled with technological advantage and imperial ambition, can become catalysts for profound transformation. Today, the legacy of that era continues to inform global conversations about trade, sovereignty, and national resilience. The 19th century crisis reminds us that markets are never purely economic spaces. They are arenas where power, law, and identity intersect. In Qing China, opium was the commodity through which those intersections became visible. Its story marks the turning point between imperial stability and modern upheaval, a reminder that even the greatest empires can be reshaped by forces that begin quietly, in the holds of trading ships, and end by rewriting history. As we draw this exploration to a close, it is worth reflecting on how the Opium Wars and the wider opium trade altered not just China's institutions, but its sense of historical direction. Before the 19th century, the Qing dynasty could look backward to centuries of imperial continuity. Dynasties had risen and fallen, but the civilizational framework endured. There was a deep confidence that disruption, however severe, would eventually be absorbed into a restored order centered on the emperor. The opium crisis unsettled that expectation. For the first time in generations, the greatest threats were not nomadic confederations on distant frontiers or internal claimants to the throne. They were industrial states arriving by sea, demanding permanent commercial access and legal privileges. These powers did not seek to replace the emperor with their own monarch. Instead, they carved out zones of influence within the existing system, gradually limiting its authority. This form of pressure was unfamiliar and difficult to counter using traditional methods of frontier defense or dynastic suppression. The resulting instability forced Chinese thinkers to reconsider the meaning of sovereignty. In earlier centuries, sovereignty had been tied closely to ritual hierarchy and territorial control. In the 19th century, it became increasingly linked to industrial capacity, fiscal autonomy, and diplomatic parity. The unequal treaties signed after the Opium Wars made clear that without tariff control and legal jurisdiction, formal sovereignty could exist alongside practical limitation. That realization shaped reform agendas for decades to come. In many ways, the destruction associated with the opium trade was as much psychological as material. Defeat in war can damage infrastructure and finances, but it also reshapes collective confidence. The Qing dynasty's aura of invincibility faded. Regional elites, seeing central weakness, gained leverage. Foreign powers, observing vulnerability, pressed for additional concessions. Each new treaty reinforced the perception that the empire was losing control over its own trajectory. Such perceptions, once widely shared, can be as destabilizing as armies. Yet history also shows resilience emerging from crisis. The late Qing period witnessed new schools, translation bureaus, modern arsenals, and constitutional experiments. Intellectual exchange expanded. Students traveled abroad. Political movements advocating reform and later revolution were rooted in a determination to prevent future humiliation. Although the dynasty itself did not survive these transformations, the impulse to rebuild national strength did. The story of how the opium trade helped destroy China's greatest empire is therefore not only about decline. It is about transition from one global order to another. The 18th century world, in which China could regulate foreign commerce within a tribute framework, gave way to a 19th century world dominated by industrial capitalism and naval projection. The Qing state encountered that shift abruptly and under unfavorable conditions. Opium was the mechanism through which economic imbalance turned into military confrontation and diplomatic constraint. For modern audiences, especially in countries once central to that trade, this history encourages careful reflection on the relationship between commerce and power. Economic advantage can become coercive when backed by force. Technological superiority can transform negotiation into imposition. And policies that appear profitable in one era can carry consequences that echo for generations. In the calm light of hindsight, the fall of the Qing dynasty appears as a slow reconfiguration rather than a sudden collapse. The opium trade marked the beginning of that reconfiguration. It weakened fiscal foundations, exposed military limitations, and challenged the intellectual assumptions of imperial governance. Over time, those strains accumulated until the old order could no longer sustain itself. Empires are rarely undone by a single cause. They are reshaped by converging pressures, economic, technological, political, and cultural. In 19th century China, opium became the thread connecting those pressures. Through it, we see how global trade can alter domestic stability, how distant decisions can transform local lives, and how even the most established empire can be drawn into a new era it did not anticipate. And that, perhaps, is the enduring lesson of this chapter in history, that power in one age does not guarantee security. There is one final layer to consider in understanding how the opium trade unraveled the Qing Empire: legitimacy. Every long-lasting state depends not only on force or wealth, but on a widely accepted belief that it has the right to govern. In imperial China, this belief was framed through the concept of the mandate of heaven. Natural disasters, rebellions, and foreign invasions were often interpreted as signs that a dynasty had lost moral alignment. While such interpretations were never purely religious, they carried deep cultural weight. The opium crisis fed directly into this erosion of legitimacy. When foreign powers compelled concessions through military force, the image of the emperor as the ultimate guardian of order weakened. When silver drained from the economy and social distress increased, confidence in imperial stewardship declined. When rebellions spread across vast regions, It reinforced the perception that heaven's favor might be shifting. Even if many subjects remained loyal, the psychological foundation of rule had cracked. What makes this episode particularly striking is that the Qing had once demonstrated remarkable adaptability. In earlier centuries, the dynasty expanded territory, integrated diverse populations, and managed complex frontier politics. It successfully navigated internal revolts and external threats. But adaptation requires recognizing when circumstances have fundamentally changed. The 19th century presented not just new challenges, but a new global structure shaped by industrialization, capitalist finance, and imperial competition on a worldwide scale. The opium trade became the gateway through which that global structure pressed inward. It connected rural farmers in India, British financiers, shipping magnates, Chinese coastal merchants, and imperial officials in Beijing. It showed that local stability could be disrupted by decisions made thousands of miles away. And once military defeat followed economic conflict, the Qing faced the compounded effect of humiliation abroad and unrest at home. By the early 20th century, reformist and revolutionary thinkers drew explicit lessons from this experience. They argued that without industrial strength, scientific education, and centralized political reform, China would remain vulnerable. In speeches and writings, the Opium Wars were cited as warnings against complacency. They became part of a broader narrative about awakening from isolation into a competitive international system. At the same time, it is important to avoid viewing the Qing solely through the lens of failure. The dynasty's long endurance and the complexity of its administrative structure remind us that collapse was not inevitable. Historical outcomes depend on timing, leadership, and global context. Had industrialization reached East Asia earlier in different forms, or had reform consolidated more quickly, the trajectory might have been altered. Yet, by the time decisive reform gained momentum, external pressures had already multiplied. In that sense, the destruction of China's greatest empire was gradual but cumulative. The opium trade did not deliver a single fatal blow. Instead, it initiated a sequence of imbalances: financial, diplomatic, military, and psychological. Each imbalance reinforced the others. Sovereignty narrowed, confidence diminished, reform lagged behind necessity. Over decades, the imperial structure that had once appeared stable became increasingly fragile. Today, when historians revisit this period, they often emphasize interconnection. The 19th century was the first truly global century in terms of trade, finance, and communication. The Qing Empire's experience illustrates how deeply those connections could transform societies. Opium was the commodity that revealed this transformation most starkly, but the underlying shift was structural. In the quiet rhythm of long-form reflection, the lesson is neither accusation nor nostalgia. It is recognition. Recognition that global trade can empower as well as destabilize. Recognition that technological disparity can reshape diplomacy. And recognition that the endurance of any political system depends on its capacity to adapt before pressure becomes overwhelming. The Qing dynasty's fall marked the end of one chapter in Chinese history and the beginning of another defined by reform, revolution, and renewed assertions of sovereignty. The opium trade stands at the hinge of that transition, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can be transformed when commerce, coercion, and change converge. As we reflect one last time on this turning point, it becomes clear that the opium trade did something few single forces in history managed to do. It altered the rhythm of an empire. For centuries, change within China had followed a familiar cycle. Dynasties rose, consolidated authority, faced internal strain, and were eventually replaced. Yet the civilizational core remained steady. What unfolded in the 19th century disrupted that pattern. The Qing did not simply decline in the traditional sense. It was drawn into a global transformation that redefined the very terms of power. Opium exposed how vulnerable even a vast agrarian empire could be when confronted by industrial capitalism backed by naval strength. The Qing state was not ignorant of reform, nor incapable of strategic thought. But its institutional culture had evolved in a world where land, grain, and tribute defined stability. The industrial age redefined stability in terms of factories, mechanized fleets, and financial systems capable of mobilizing resources across oceans. The opium trade connected China directly to that emerging order, not through gradual partnership, but through coercive imbalance. There is also a human continuity that runs quietly through this story. Generations who lived through the Opium Wars passed down memory of unequal treaties and foreign concessions. These memories shaped how later leaders understood diplomacy. When 20th century governments insisted on renegotiating treaties and restoring tariff autonomy, they were responding to lived historical experience. The pain associated with the opium era became part of national identity, reinforcing a determination to avoid similar dependency in the future. At the same time, the episode reveals something broader about empires everywhere. Economic relationships can create dependencies that seem manageable in the short term but become destabilizing over decades. When a state relies on outdated assumptions about its position in the world, adaptation slows. When adaptation slows, external pressures gain leverage. The Qing dynasty's confrontation with the opium trade illustrates how quickly that leverage can accumulate once a structural imbalance takes hold. And yet, it is equally true that the story did not end with permanent decline. The collapse of the Qing opened the path to new political experiments, new institutions, and ultimately new forms of statehood. The trauma of the 19th century became fuel for modernization drives, educational reform, and industrial ambition. In that sense, destruction and transformation were intertwined. The empire fell, but the society endured and redefined itself. Looking back calmly, without exaggeration or simplification, we see that the opium trade was both catalyst and symbol. It catalyzed conflict between incompatible economic systems. It symbolized the dangers of technological disparity and commercial coercion. And it marked the moment when China's greatest imperial structure began to lose control over the pace and direction of change. History rarely offers neat conclusions. The forces that destroyed the Qing were layered and cumulative. But by tracing the arc of the opium trade, from profitable commodity to diplomatic crisis, from military confrontation to political erosion, we gain a clearer understanding of how empires are reshaped. They are not only conquered from without, they are weakened when external shocks expose internal limits. In the end, the opium trade did not simply damage China's greatest empire. It ushered China into a new era, painful, contested, transformative. It reminds us that global integration, when driven by imbalance rather than mutual exchange, can carry consequences that echo for generations. And it stands as a quiet but powerful lesson in how commerce, when combined with ambition and technological change, can alter the course of history itself. Before we close completely, it is worth placing the Qing experience alongside other empires of the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire, the Mughal successor states in India, and various kingdoms in Africa and Southeast Asia all faced similar pressures from industrial European powers. What distinguishes the Qing case is scale. China was not a minor kingdom on the margins of global trade. It was one of the largest political entities on Earth. Its population dwarfed that of most European states. Its economy by sheer output was immense. And yet scale alone did not guarantee insulation. The opium trade demonstrated that leverage in the industrial age did not always require territorial conquest. It could operate through ports, tariffs, and treaty clauses. Instead of annexing all of China, foreign powers often preferred limited but strategic access, control over customs revenues, secured enclaves for commerce, and legal privileges for their citizens. This approach allowed influence without full administrative responsibility. For the Qing court, this incremental erosion was particularly destabilizing because it blurred the line between sovereignty and subordination. The empire remained intact on maps, yet its autonomy narrowed in practice. There is also a generational aspect to decline. Officials who had grown up during periods of stability may have underestimated the permanence of new pressures. Reformers who recognized the urgency of modernization often faced institutional inertia. By the time younger generations pushed for deeper political restructuring, frustration had hardened into revolutionary energy. The memory of the Opium Wars lingered as evidence that partial reform was insufficient. This generational shift contributed to the revolutionary atmosphere of the early 20th century. Another important element is economic redirection. Treaty ports such as Shanghai evolved into dynamic commercial hubs integrated with global markets. Railways and telegraph lines, introduced partly under foreign influence, began reshaping internal trade patterns. While these developments eventually supported modernization, they also redirected economic gravity away from traditional administrative centers. Coastal regions linked to global commerce gained prominence, sometimes at the expense of inland authority. The Qing dynasty had to manage an economy that was no longer entirely structured around its own regulatory framework. Throughout all these changes, opium remained an emblem of vulnerability. Even when later campaigns reduced consumption and international agreements sought regulation, the earlier decades of coercive trade left a lasting imprint. The association between economic weakness and foreign interference became deeply embedded in political thought. This association would influence policy choices well beyond the Qing era, shaping how leaders evaluated foreign investment, trade agreements, and military preparedness. In a broader sense, the fall of the Qing illustrates a universal historical pattern. Empires anchored in one technological and economic system struggle when that system shifts. Adaptation requires not only new tools but new assumptions. The Qing confronted industrial modernity while still rooted in agrarian governance. Its attempts to graft modern arsenals and shipyards onto older bureaucratic foundations achieved limited success but did not fully bridge the structural divide. Yet it would be misleading to end on a note of inevitability. History is shaped by choices as well as forces. The decisions made by British merchants and officials to promote opium sales were deliberate. The decisions made by Qing officials to prohibit or resist the trade were equally deliberate. The wars that followed were not accidents of fate. They were consequences of competing priorities and incompatible visions of commerce and sovereignty. When we consider how the opium trade helped destroy China's greatest empire, we see the convergence of those decisions within a rapidly changing global landscape. We see how economic interests can escalate into armed conflict. We see how technological disparity can magnify disputes. And we see how the cumulative impact of humiliation, fiscal strain, and internal unrest can undermine even the most established institutions. In the calm after this long examination, the Qing story stands as a reminder that history often turns not only on grand conquests, but on trade routes and balance sheets. The cargo in a ship's hold can matter as much as the soldiers on its deck. And in the 19th century, that cargo, opium, became one of the quiet forces that reshaped the destiny of an empire. As we settle into the final reflections of this documentary, it becomes clear that the Opium Wars marked more than the weakening of a dynasty. They marked the end of an era in which China could remain relatively insulated from the mechanisms of global capitalism. For centuries, the Qing court had regulated foreign trade through tightly controlled ports and ceremonial diplomacy. That system functioned effectively so long as China's economic weight allowed it to dictate terms. But once industrial production and maritime power shifted the balance, regulation without leverage became increasingly fragile. The opium trade exploited that fragility. It revealed how difficult it is for any state to prohibit a highly profitable commodity when foreign actors are willing to defend it militarily. Smuggling networks adapted quickly. Coastal geography made enforcement uneven. Corruption blurred lines between public authority and private gain. What might have remained a contained vice expanded into a structural imbalance because global demand and imperial ambition reinforced it. In many ways, the Qing court faced a dilemma that modern governments would recognize. Strict enforcement risked provoking powerful trading partners. Legalization risked normalizing social harm. Negotiation required accepting diplomatic equality that challenged traditional hierarchy. Each option carried costs. The decision to confront the trade head-on under Lin Zexu was rooted in moral conviction and sovereign authority, yet it collided with a different conception of international order, one grounded in free trade ideology backed by naval strength. The defeat that followed did more than impose indemnities. It institutionalized inequality through treaty provisions. Fixed tariffs limited fiscal flexibility. Extraterritorial courts constrained legal sovereignty. Missionary protections altered social dynamics in certain regions. These changes were gradual in their impact but cumulative in their effect. They created a layered system in which Qing authority coexisted uneasily with foreign privileges. Over the next decades, reform efforts sought to close the technological gap. Shipyards were built, arsenals expanded, and students dispatched abroad. Yet modernization required sustained coordination and financial investment. Regional leaders often acted independently, creating fragmented progress. Court politics slowed systemic reform. Meanwhile, foreign pressure did not pause. Each new crisis, whether another war, a rebellion, or a diplomatic dispute, further strained confidence. The symbolic weight of opium endured precisely because it encapsulated these overlapping weaknesses. It represented economic imbalance, social harm, foreign coercion, and institutional rigidity all at once. In later nationalist narratives, it became shorthand for a century in which China struggled to assert control over its own destiny. The phrase unequal treaties carried with it the memory of gunboats enforcing commercial access. And yet, even in decline, the Qing period laid foundations for future transformation. Exposure to foreign technology and ideas accelerated educational reform. Translation of Western scientific texts expanded intellectual horizons. The urgency created by defeat spurred debates about constitutional monarchy, republicanism, and industrial policy. While the dynasty itself fell, the conversations it was forced to confront shaped the political evolution that followed. From a long historical perspective, the destruction of China's greatest empire was neither instantaneous nor solely imposed from outside. It was the product of convergence, industrial expansion abroad, structural strain at home, and a trade system that amplified imbalance. Opium served as the medium through which these forces interacted. It was profitable enough to defend, harmful enough to destabilize, and politically charged enough to ignite conflict. In the quiet assessment of history, this episode reminds us that power is relational. It depends not only on internal strength, but on how that strength compares to others in a changing environment. The Qing Empire had once stood at the center of its regional world. By the mid-19th century, the world itself had expanded and accelerated. The empire's institutions struggled to match that pace. Ultimately, the opium trade did not simply erode silver reserves or provoke naval battles. It marked the moment when China's imperial order encountered a new global system and found itself at a disadvantage. The consequences unfolded over decades, culminating in revolution and the end of dynastic rule. But the roots of that transformation can be traced back to the holds of merchant ships and the decisions of officials grappling with forces larger than any one decree. And that is where the story rests. Not in a single war or treaty, but in the steady shift of global power that turned commerce into confrontation and confrontation into change. In the final analysis, what makes the opium trade so central to the fall of the Qing Empire is not only the wars it triggered, but the precedent it set. After the first concessions were extracted by force, other powers observed carefully. France, the United States, Russia, and later Japan sought similar arrangements. Each negotiation built upon the last. Each treaty normalized the idea that China could be pressured into compliance. The cumulative effect was to internationalize China's internal affairs. This internationalization changed the operating environment of the Qing state. Customs revenues, once fully sovereign, became entangled with foreign oversight. Maritime trade passed increasingly through treaty ports where foreign influence was strong. Even when reforms succeeded locally, they unfolded within constraints shaped by earlier defeats. The dynasty no longer controlled the pace of engagement with the outside world. It was responding to it. At the same time, the presence of foreign communities inside China introduced new currents of exchange. Western medicine, engineering, printing techniques, and political ideas entered through the same ports that had been opened under duress. This created a paradox. The crisis that weakened the Qing also accelerated exposure to tools that might have strengthened it. Some officials recognized this irony. They sought to adopt foreign technology while preserving Chinese moral foundations, a strategy often summarized as Chinese learning for essence, Western learning for utility. The challenge lay in translating that principle into coordinated policy. As decades passed, reform movements grew more ambitious. Calls for constitutional governance, broader education, and industrial planning reflected an understanding that limited modernization was insufficient. Yet sweeping change threatened entrenched interests and long-standing hierarchies. The Qing court oscillated between cautious reform and retrenchment. In this hesitation, revolutionary movements gained momentum, arguing that only a complete break with imperial structures could restore strength. The symbolic association between opium and weakness continued to resonate. It was invoked as proof that complacency invited exploitation. It was cited as evidence that technological disparity could overturn centuries of stability. And it was remembered as a moment when moral outrage, unaccompanied by adequate power, proved ineffective. These lessons shaped political rhetoric long after the dynasty itself had ended. When the Qing finally fell in 1911, the immediate causes included military mutiny and provincial dissent. But the deeper causes stretched back to the mid-19th century. The empire's fiscal system had been strained by indemnities. Its military credibility had been diminished by defeat. Its intellectual foundations had been challenged by exposure to global ideas. Opium was the thread connecting these strands, a commercial entry point that became a geopolitical rupture. In closing, the story of how the opium trade helped destroy China's greatest empire is ultimately a story about imbalance. Imbalance between industrial and agrarian systems. Imbalance between naval projection and coastal defense. Imbalance between commercial ambition and regulatory authority. When such imbalances persist, they tend to generate crisis. Yet history also reminds us that crisis can be transformative. The Qing collapse did not erase Chinese civilization. It reshaped it. Out of the turmoil emerged new political forms, new economic strategies, and renewed efforts to secure sovereignty. The memory of the opium era remained a cautionary tale, influencing how future leaders approach trade, diplomacy, and modernization. For those of us looking back from a distance, the lesson is steady and measured. Empires are not destroyed overnight and rarely by a single cause. They are tested by change. When change arrives faster than institutions can adapt, even long-standing systems may falter. In 19th century China, opium was the catalyst that revealed those limits. Through it, commerce became conflict, and conflict became transformation. And that is the enduring significance of this chapter in history. A reminder that the quiet exchange of goods can alter the fate of nations, and that the greatest empires are never immune to the pressures of a changing world. As we conclude this extended journey through the 19th century, one final observation lingers. The destruction associated with the opium trade was not simply about material loss or territorial concession. It was about the erosion of strategic autonomy. Before the crisis, the Qing dynasty could choose how and when to engage the outside world. After the Opium Wars, that choice narrowed. Engagement was no longer optional. It was structured by treaty obligations and enforced by the demonstrated willingness of foreign powers to intervene. This shift from controlled interaction to compelled participation marked a profound turning point. The Qing had long believed that foreign trade was a privilege granted by the emperor. In the industrial age, trade became a mechanism through which outside states could demand access, leverage markets, and secure political footholds. The opium trade was the wedge that forced open this new reality. Over time, that forced opening reshaped China's economic geography. Coastal regions tied to treaty ports became gateways for global commerce. Inland areas felt the ripple effects through shifting silver flows and altered trade patterns. Some Chinese merchants prospered in the new environment, adapting quickly to international finance and shipping networks. Others struggled as traditional systems adjusted unevenly. The result was a more interconnected but also more unstable economic landscape. Diplomatically, the Qing court found itself navigating a web of competing foreign interests. No longer dealing with a single external rival, it faced multiple powers, each seeking advantage. Concessions granted to one often had to be extended to others. This most favored nation principle multiplied obligations and reduced room for maneuver. The state's foreign policy became reactive, attempting to balance pressures rather than define terms. Internally, the cumulative strain fostered debate about identity and reform. Intellectuals asked whether preserving tradition required selective adaptation or radical transformation. Some believed the dynasty could still reform itself into a constitutional monarchy. Others concluded that only a republic could restore legitimacy. Beneath these political arguments lay the shared memory of earlier humiliation. The Opium era had demonstrated the cost of technological and institutional lag. It served as a warning against delay. In assessing responsibility, it is essential to recognize that global expansion was a defining feature of the 19th century. Industrial powers sought markets, resources, and strategic footholds across continents. China was not uniquely targeted, but its size and economic weight made it a significant prize. The tragedy was not that it engaged in trade, but that trade was weaponized against it. When we examine how the opium trade helped destroy China's greatest empire, we see the intersection of commerce and coercion. We see how a profitable commodity, shielded by naval superiority, can override local law. We see how repeated concessions can weaken confidence in governance. And we see how the cumulative effect of external pressure and internal strain can reshape a civilization's political structure. Yet within that upheaval lay the seeds of renewal, the determination to modernize, to industrialize, and to reclaim sovereignty drew strength from the memory of vulnerability. The collapse of the Qing was painful and destabilizing, but it also cleared space for reimagining the state in a modern context. The lessons of the opium crisis became part of the intellectual foundation for 20th century reform and reconstruction. In the end, the story stands as a measured reminder. Power in one era does not guarantee resilience in the next. Economic relationships can carry strategic consequences. And adaptation, though difficult, is often the dividing line between endurance and decline. The Qing Empire's encounter with the opium trade illustrates how global forces can penetrate even the most established systems, setting in motion changes that unfold over generations. Through this lens, the opium trade is not merely a chapter of conflict. It is a hinge in world history, a moment when trade routes, industrial ambition, and imperial policy converged to transform the fate of an empire that once seemed unshakable. As we reach the final stretch of this story, it helps to reflect on how historians today interpret the long aftermath of the Opium Wars. In recent decades, scholarship has moved beyond viewing the Qing collapse as simple stagnation. Instead, it emphasizes structural transition. The 19th century was not merely an era in which China fell behind. It was an era in which the global definition of power shifted dramatically. Industrial production, mechanized warfare, and integrated financial markets became the new benchmarks. States that adapted early gained leverage. States that adapted slowly faced mounting pressure. The opium trade forced the Qing into that new environment abruptly and under unfavorable terms. It exposed the limits of an agrarian tax base in financing industrial defense. It revealed how vulnerable coastal regions were to naval bombardment. It demonstrated that moral condemnation alone could not deter profit-driven expansion. In this way, opium was less the sole cause of collapse and more the catalyst that revealed underlying asymmetries. There is also an international legal dimension that deserves attention. The unequal treaties imposed after the Opium Wars reshaped China's legal landscape. Extraterritoriality meant that foreign nationals were tried in their own courts, not under Qing law. Fixed low tariffs limited China's ability to protect domestic industries or just fiscal policy. These constraints were not temporary. They persisted for decades. They represented a formal acknowledgement of diminished sovereignty within an international order increasingly defined by Western legal norms. For Chinese reformers, this legal imbalance underscored the need to study international law, diplomacy, and constitutional systems. New schools introduced curricula that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. Translation projects brought foreign political philosophy into Chinese discourse. The shock of the opium era, while destabilizing, accelerated intellectual exchange. Exposure to new ideas became part of the long process of national transformation. At the social level, the memory of addiction and exploitation remained powerful. Anti-opium campaigns in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not only public health initiatives. They were symbolic acts of resistance. Suppressing opium became associated with moral recovery and national revival. The very substance that had once signaled weakness was redefined as something to be eradicated in the name of sovereignty. By the time the Qing dynasty formally ended in 1911, the political vocabulary of China had changed profoundly. Concepts such as nation-state, constitution, parliament, and industrial planning had entered public debate. These ideas did not emerge in isolation. They were responses to decades of confrontation with global modernity. The opium trade had been one of the first confrontations in that sequence. Looking back calmly, the destruction of China's greatest empire appears as a prolonged negotiation with change. The Qing did not vanish instantly. It struggled, adapted in parts, and resisted in others. But the pace of global transformation outstripped its capacity for comprehensive reform. The opium trade stands at the beginning of that imbalance, a moment when economic pressure became military coercion, and coercion reshaped political imagination. For audiences today, especially in countries historically involved in the trade, this chapter invites thoughtful reflection. It challenges the notion that commerce is neutral. It reminds us that economic decisions can carry ethical and geopolitical weight. And it underscores how technological disparity can transform trade disputes into structural shifts in power. Ultimately, the story of the opium trade and the fall of the Qing Empire is about transition from one world order to another. It marks the passage from a tribute-based regional hierarchy to a global system defined by industrial competition and legal standardization. In that transition, China endured humiliation, reform, rebellion, and reinvention. And so the quiet conclusion of this long narrative is not only about loss. It is about transformation under pressure. The opium trade did not erase Chinese civilization. but it did fracture the imperial framework that had governed it for centuries. In doing so, it opened the path through turmoil and struggle to a new era defined not by dynastic rule, but by the search for modern sovereignty in an interconnected world. As we offer a final reflection on this era, it is important to understand that the Qing collapse did not occur in isolation from global transformation. The 19th century was defined by accelerating integration, steamships crossing oceans faster than ever before, telegraph cables shrinking communication time, and financial markets linking distant capitals. The Opium Wars were one of the earliest moments when China was forcibly drawn into that accelerating network. Before this period, China had participated in global trade, but largely on its own terms. The Canton system tightly regulated foreign merchants. Tribute diplomacy preserved symbolic hierarchy. Trade was permitted, but structured within imperial boundaries. The opium trade disrupted that structure because it operated outside official approval and was backed by governments willing to enforce commercial access through violence. Once military defeat followed economic dispute, the older regulatory framework could not be restored in its original form. The transformation that followed was uneven. Treaty ports became laboratories of modernization. Western architecture, banking practices, and educational institutions appeared alongside traditional markets and guilds. Railways and telegraph lines expanded gradually, often financed or supervised by foreign interests. While these changes introduced new efficiencies, they also deepened the sense that China's modernization was occurring under constraint rather than full sovereignty. At the same time, new generations of Chinese thinkers began to articulate a different vision of the nation. The language of empire gave way to the language of nationalism. Instead of loyalty centered solely on a dynasty, reformers emphasized loyalty to a people and a territory that required protection through modernization. The humiliation associated with the Opium era became part of this nationalist awakening. It was cited as evidence that without unity and industrial strength, external pressure would continue. The opium trade thus occupies a pivotal position in Chinese historical memory. It is remembered not simply as a harmful commerce, but as the beginning of a period when the country's autonomy narrowed under external coercion. That memory has shaped diplomatic posture and domestic reform well into the modern era. Policies prioritizing technological development, economic independence, and centralized authority often trace intellectual lineage back to the lessons drawn from the 19th century. Yet history remains complex. The Qing dynasty's fall cannot be reduced to external aggression alone. Internal demographic pressures, administrative corruption, natural disasters, and ideological ferment all contributed. What the opium trade did was accelerate exposure. It exposed weaknesses in fiscal structure. It exposed military limitations. And it exposed the fragility of a worldview built for a different international system. When we speak of destruction, we should understand it as transformation through imbalance. The empire's institutions were not obliterated overnight. They were gradually overshadowed by new realities. The dynasty that had once governed a vast agrarian civilization found itself navigating a global industrial order without the necessary tools or unified reform. In the steady rhythm of historical perspective, the lesson is measured. Global power shifts rarely announce themselves with a single event. They unfold through economic patterns, technological innovation, and strategic decisions. The opium trade was one such pattern. a profitable circuit that evolved into geopolitical confrontation. Through it, the Qing Empire confronted a world that had changed more rapidly than its own structures could accommodate. And so, the story ends not with a single battle or treaty, but with a realization. Even the greatest empires are bound by context. When that context shifts, when trade becomes coercion, when technology redefines warfare, when markets outrun tradition, adaptation becomes essential. The Qing dynasty's encounter with the opium trade reveals how difficult that adaptation can be and how profound its consequences. In that quiet understanding lies the enduring weight of this history, a reminder that commerce, when intertwined with power, can alter the trajectory of civilizations, and that resilience in one century does not guarantee security in the next. As we bring this long narrative fully into perspective, it is worth asking one final question. Could the Qing Empire have survived the 19th century intact without the opium trade? Counterfactual history is always uncertain, but the question itself reveals something important. Industrial expansion in Europe and Japan would still have transformed global power dynamics. Steam navigation, modern artillery, and integrated finance would still have shifted leverage toward states that industrialized early. Yet without the catalytic shock of the opium crisis, China's transition into that new world might have unfolded more gradually. The opium trade compressed time. It forced confrontation before the Qing had restructured its military or fiscal systems. It triggered wars that exposed technological disparity in dramatic fashion. And it institutionalized inequality through treaties that limited economic autonomy for decades. In doing so, it accelerated pressures that might otherwise have accumulated more slowly. The dynasty was compelled to respond under conditions not of its choosing. Another lasting consequence was the transformation of China's relationship with the sea. For centuries, imperial attention had been oriented toward land frontiers, Central Asia, Mongolia, Tibet. Maritime defense was important but not existential. The Opium Wars altered that calculation. Coastal vulnerability became undeniable. Naval modernization moved from peripheral concern to urgent necessity. The awareness that power could arrive from the ocean reshaped strategic thinking well into the 20th century. The psychological dimension also endured. National memory of the opium era framed foreign encroachment as a lesson in vigilance. This memory influenced not only political rhetoric but educational curricula and public consciousness. The phrase "century of humiliation" captured the sense that sovereignty had been compromised in stages, beginning with coerced trade. That narrative has continued to shape how modern China interprets its role in global affairs. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that the period following the Opium Wars was not one of uniform stagnation. Chinese entrepreneurs engaged actively in new commercial ventures. Reformist officials experimented with administrative changes. Intellectual life diversified as translations of foreign works circulated more widely. Even within constraint, agency remained. The Qing system struggled, but society was not static. In the broader sweep of world history, the story of the opium trade illustrates how economic instruments can precede territorial conquest. Unlike classic colonial annexation, the early phases of Western involvement in China relied on treaty rights and commercial access rather than outright governance. This approach allowed influence to expand incrementally. It blurred the distinction between sovereignty and dependency, and it demonstrated that control over trade flows could yield political leverage without formal colonization. When the Qing dynasty ultimately collapsed in 1911, it did so amid internal revolution rather than foreign invasion. Yet the context of that revolution had been shaped profoundly by the decades following the Opium Wars. Fiscal strain from indemnities, weakened military credibility, fragmented regional authority, and a growing reformist intelligentsia all traced part of their origins to that earlier confrontation. Opium was the starting signal in a longer relay of transformation. If there is a steady lesson in this history, it is that resilience requires more than past success. It requires anticipation of structural change. The Qing Empire entered the 19th century confident in its institutions and cultural foundations. By mid-century, it was confronting an international order organized around industrial production and maritime dominance. The opium trade revealed the gap between those two realities with unsettling clarity. And so we end where we began, with the quiet recognition that empires rarely fall from a single blow. They are reshaped when economic currents, technological shifts, and political decisions converge. In Qing China, opium was the medium through which that convergence became visible. It linked distant markets to domestic vulnerability and turned trade into a catalyst for imperial decline. The legacy of that moment endures, not as a simple story of loss, but as a complex reminder that global commerce carries strategic weight, that adaptation is never optional in times of rapid change, and that even the most enduring empires must evolve or risk being overtaken by the world they once believed they defined. As we close this extended examination, it is worth reflecting on how the Qing experience fits into a broader pattern of global transition. The 19th century did not simply witness the expansion of European empires. It witnessed the reordering of economic logic itself. Industrial production created surplus goods. Surplus goods required markets. Markets required access. Access, when resisted, could be enforced. The opium trade was one of the earliest and clearest demonstrations of that chain in action within East Asia. For the Qing court, the shock was not only military defeat but the realization that economic pressure could be systematically applied from afar. In earlier eras, threats were visible at borders. In the opium crisis, the threat arrived as trade, initially incremental, seemingly commercial, yet backed by geopolitical resolve. Once conflict erupted, it revealed how commercial disputes could escalate into wars that reshaped sovereignty. Over time, the dynasty's response oscillated between resistance and adaptation. Reformers advocated institutional change. Conservatives urged caution. Regional leaders strengthened local forces to suppress rebellions. But this decentralization weakened central authority. Financial reforms were attempted, yet indemnities and constrained tariffs limited flexibility. Each effort addressed part of the problem, but no single reform fully resolved the structural imbalance revealed in the 1840s. The symbolic resonance of opium endured precisely because it encapsulated this imbalance. It was at once a commodity, a vice, a fiscal drain, and a diplomatic flashpoint. It connected the lives of rural farmers in India, industrial financiers in Britain, and coastal merchants in China. It tied household addiction to imperial strategy. In doing so, it illustrated the interconnectedness of a rapidly globalizing world. When the Qing dynasty finally ended, the revolutionaries who replaced it inherited both the scars and the lessons of the opium era. Their vision of national renewal emphasized industrial capacity, military modernization, and centralized authority. Even when political ideology shifted in later decades, the underlying commitment to sovereignty and economic self-determination remained rooted in the memory of earlier vulnerability. Looking back with measured distance, it becomes clear that the destruction of China's greatest empire was not a sudden collapse but a drawn-out recalibration. The opium trade marked the beginning of that recalibration. It exposed weaknesses that might otherwise have remained partially concealed. It forced engagement with a global system organized around industrial power. And it set in motion reforms and revolutions that reshaped China's political landscape. For modern audiences, this history offers a steady reminder that trade is never merely transactional. It operates within systems of law, technology, and power. When those systems are unequal, commerce can become coercion. When technological disparities widen, diplomacy can tilt into compulsion. The Qing Empire's confrontation with the opium trade demonstrates how deeply those dynamics can alter a civilization's trajectory. In the quiet rhythm of historical reflection, the lesson is neither triumphalist nor accusatory. It is analytical. It shows how economic incentives, when combined with strategic ambition, can erode even long-standing institutions. It shows how adaptation, though difficult, is essential in moments of structural change. And it reminds us that the forces shaping global history often begin not with declarations of war, but with ships entering harbor under the banner of trade. The story of the opium trade and the fall of the Qing Empire ultimately speaks to transformation under pressure. It reveals how the intersection of commerce and coercion can shift the balance of power across continents. And it stands as a careful, enduring example of how the currents of global change can reshape even the most established empires when they arrive faster than institutions can evolve. As we enter the final stretch of this long historical arc, it is worth slowing down and considering the deeper structural transformation that the opium crisis set in motion. When historians describe the Opium Wars as the beginning of China's modern era, they are not simply marking a date on a timeline. They are identifying a moment when the underlying logic of political survival changed. Before the 19th century, the Qing Empire's security rested on agricultural productivity, bureaucratic continuity, and frontier management. Stability meant ensuring grain supply, suppressing rebellion, and maintaining ritual hierarchy in foreign relations. Naval supremacy and industrial output were not irrelevant, but they were not decisive in the same way they would become. The opium trade, backed by steam-powered fleets and modern artillery, revealed that this older matrix of stability was no longer sufficient. The wars that followed did more than extract concessions. They redefined vulnerability. Coastal cities could be bombarded with relative ease. River systems once considered internal arteries became avenues for foreign naval penetration. Trade routes once tightly regulated under imperial oversight were opened under external pressure. The geography of security shifted from land-based frontiers to maritime exposure. Financially, the consequences were equally profound. Indemnities imposed after defeat required large transfers of silver. Combined with earlier outflows linked to opium purchases, these payments intensified fiscal strain. The Qing tax system, rooted in agrarian assessment and relatively fixed quotas, struggled to adjust rapidly. Attempts to modernize revenue collection came late and unevenly. Meanwhile, foreign powers gained influence over maritime customs administration, further limiting autonomous control over trade income. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. For centuries, the imperial center had represented unchallenged authority. Even when local unrest flared, the idea of a coherent moral order persisted. After the Opium Wars, that aura diminished. When foreign envoys insisted on diplomatic equality and refused to participate in traditional tribute rituals, it signaled that symbolic hierarchy no longer translated into practical power. The Qing court faced not only military defeat but ideological displacement. Yet the story is not one of passive decline. The latter half of the 19th century saw serious attempts at institutional renewal. Shipyards in Fuzhou and arsenals in Shanghai reflected recognition that technological modernization was essential. Educational reforms introduced mathematics, engineering, and foreign languages into elite curricula. Diplomatic missions traveled abroad to study constitutional systems and industrial methods. These initiatives reveal that the Qing elite understood the scale of the challenge. The difficulty lay in coordination and timing. Reform required central authority strong enough to overcome entrenched interests. But central authority had already been weakened by rebellion and foreign pressure. Regional leaders who raised modernized armies to suppress uprisings gained political leverage, fragmenting power further. Modernization advanced in pockets rather than uniformly across the empire. The result was a state partially transformed yet structurally divided. Opium, throughout this period, remained a symbol of the original rupture. Efforts to curtail domestic production and consumption intensified in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. International conferences began addressing narcotics control, reflecting shifting global norms. Ironically, a commodity once defended as legitimate trade gradually became subject to multilateral restriction. This shift underscored how profoundly perceptions had changed since the 1840s. When the Qing dynasty ultimately fell in 1911, the event was both abrupt and long in preparation. Military mutinies and provincial declarations provided the immediate trigger. But the deeper groundwork had been laid across decades of fiscal pressure, institutional reform, ideological debate, and diminished sovereignty. The opium trade stands at the beginning of that chain reaction, a commercial strategy that evolved into a geopolitical watershed. From a global perspective, the episode illustrates how industrial power reshaped international relations. Economic advantage, when paired with technological superiority, could compel market access. Legal systems could be exported through treaty mechanisms. Financial obligations could bind weaker states into prolonged dependency. The Qing Empire's experience became one of the earliest examples of this new dynamic in East Asia. And yet, in closing, it is important to recognize continuity as well as rupture. Chinese society endured. Cultural traditions persisted even as political forms changed. The trauma of the opium era became part of a larger narrative of resilience and renewal. 20th century leaders, regardless of ideological orientation, consistently emphasized industrial development, national unity, and sovereign control over trade. These priorities were shaped directly by lessons drawn from the 19th century. So when we ask how the opium trade destroyed China's greatest empire, we are describing more than economic imbalance or military defeat. We are describing a convergence of global transformation and domestic strain. We are tracing how commerce, backed by coercion, exposed institutional limits. And we are observing how that exposure set in motion a century of reform and revolution. In the calm light of historical reflection, the fall of the Qing is neither a simple tragedy nor an isolated collapse. It is a case study in how rapidly changing global systems can overwhelm established powers that adapt too slowly. The opium trade was the catalyst that made that reality unmistakable. Through it, trade became conflict, conflict became concession, and concession gradually reshaped an empire's fate. And that is where this story ultimately rests, not in a single battle or treaty, but in the quiet recognition that economic forces, when combined with technological change and political ambition, can alter the destiny of even the most enduring civilizations. As we move into the final reflections of this documentary, it is important to widen the lens one last time. The destruction of the Qing Empire was not simply a national story. It was part of a global reordering of power that unfolded across the 19th century. The same industrial forces that reshaped China were transforming India, the Ottoman domains, Africa, and Southeast Asia. But China's scale, history, and long-standing sense of civilizational centrality made its confrontation with industrial imperialism especially consequential. The opium trade marked the first sustained breach in the Qing Empire's ability to define the terms of foreign engagement. Once that breach occurred, it proved difficult to contain. The logic of treaty expansion followed a predictable pattern. A dispute over commerce led to armed conflict. Armed conflict led to concessions. Concessions became precedents. Precedents encouraged further demands. In this way, what began as a specific crisis over a narcotic commodity evolved into a systemic reconfiguration of sovereignty. One of the most enduring transformations was administrative. The establishment of the Imperial Maritime Customs Service under significant foreign supervision ensured more efficient revenue collection, but it also symbolized compromised autonomy. While the service provided stable income and professional management, its existence underscored how deeply foreign influence had penetrated state structures. The Qing court relied on it financially, even as it represented limitation. Meanwhile, regional militarization accelerated. In order to suppress large-scale rebellions like the Taiping Uprising, the Qing relied increasingly on provincial armies led by powerful commanders. These forces were often funded and organized locally, creating new centers of influence outside the traditional banner system. Although this strategy restored short-term stability, it weakened centralized control. By the late 19th century, the empire was more decentralized than it had been in generations. The intellectual climate also shifted decisively. Exposure to Western political theory and science prompted debates about constitutional monarchy, parliamentary governance, and national sovereignty. Reformers such as Kang Yue and Liang Qichao argued that survival required structural overhaul. The 100 Days Reform of 1898, though short-lived, revealed both the urgency of change and the resistance it faced within conservative court factions. The very intensity of these debates was a measure of how profoundly the opium era had unsettled old certainties. At the same time, Japan's rapid modernization after the Meiji Restoration provided a regional example of adaptation. When Japan defeated Qing China in 1895, the shock was severe. It demonstrated that an Asian state could industrialize successfully and challenge Imperial China militarily. This defeat reinforced the lesson first delivered during the Opium Wars. Technological modernization was no longer optional. It was existential. The memory of opium lingered through all these developments as a foundational grievance. It was cited in nationalist discourse as the opening chapter of humiliation. It represented foreign exploitation and domestic weakness intertwined. Efforts to eradicate opium consumption in the early 20th century were framed not only as public health campaigns but as moral reclamation. Eliminating opium became synonymous with restoring dignity. By the time revolution erupted in 1911, the Qing state had already undergone decades of partial transformation. Railways crisscrossed provinces. New schools educated a generation conversant in both classical texts and modern subjects. Newspapers circulated reformist ideas widely. Yet these changes unfolded within a structure that had lost its unifying authority. When provincial assemblies declared independence, the center lacked the credibility to compel loyalty. Thus, the fall of China's greatest empire was the culmination of cumulative strain. The opium trade did not single-handedly topple the dynasty, but it set the trajectory. It accelerated fiscal imbalance. It triggered wars that exposed military inferiority. It institutionalized foreign privilege. It weakened confidence in imperial governance. Over decades, these pressures converged. From a contemporary perspective, the episode offers a steady lesson in global interdependence. Trade is never purely economic when power disparities are wide. Technological advantage can transform negotiation into compulsion. And institutional inertia, even within vast and sophisticated systems, can prove costly when change is rapid. Yet there is also a narrative of resilience woven through this history. The trauma of the 19th century fostered a determination to modernize, to industrialize, and to reclaim sovereignty. 20th century political movements, whether nationalist or revolutionary, drew strength from the memory of vulnerability. The emphasis on centralized authority, economic planning, and technological development can be traced in part to the lessons of the opium era. In the calm cadence of historical reflection, the story resolves into something larger than decline. It becomes a case study in transformation under pressure. The Qing Empire, once the dominant power of East Asia, encountered a new global order defined by industrial might and maritime reach. The opium trade was the first clear sign that this order would not bend to tradition. And so we conclude not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual redefinition. The ships that carried opium to China carried more than a commodity. They carried a new balance of power. Through conflict, concession, and reform, that balance reshaped an empire and ushered in a new era of Chinese history. An era defined not by dynastic continuity, but by the pursuit of modern sovereignty in an interconnected world. As we bring this documentary to its true conclusion, it is worth pausing on the long arc of consequence that followed the first chests of opium unloaded along China's southern coast. What began as a commercial workaround to a trade imbalance evolved into a structural turning point in East Asian history. The Qing Empire did not collapse overnight, nor did it fall solely because of one commodity. But the opium trade altered the trajectory of the dynasty in ways that proved impossible to reverse. The deeper issue was not addiction alone, nor even silver outflow in isolation. It was the collision between two economic systems at different stages of technological development. The Qing state represented a highly sophisticated agrarian empire, optimized for land-based governance, bureaucratic continuity, and regional stability. Britain and other industrial powers represented a new model, production-driven economies capable of projecting naval force globally and financing sustained overseas pressure. Opium became the bridge between these systems, connecting agrarian wealth to industrial ambition. When Qing officials attempted to suppress the trade, they were acting within a long tradition of state regulation over harmful goods. But they were confronting merchants backed by governments that interpreted restriction as a violation of commercial rights. The First Opium War revealed that disputes once handled diplomatically could now be resolved militarily with industrial efficiency. The Treaty of Nanjing and subsequent agreements formalized the imbalance. China was no longer negotiating from a position of parity. It was conceding under duress. The consequences accumulated steadily. Indemnity payments strained finances. Treaty ports reoriented economic gravity toward coastal enclaves with foreign influence. Extraterritoriality fragmented legal authority. Missionary protections altered social dynamics in ways that sometimes inflamed local tension. Meanwhile, internal rebellions such as the Taiping movement devastated vast regions, compounding fiscal and administrative stress. Each crisis magnified the next. Yet even amid adversity, the Qing court attempted renewal. The self-strengthening movement sought to import Western technology without abandoning Confucian moral foundations. Arsenals, shipyards, and modern schools reflected a recognition that survival required adaptation. But modernization without structural political reform proved limited. Industrial capacity grew unevenly. Regional militarization empowered provincial leaders at the expense of central cohesion. Reformist momentum surged and stalled repeatedly. By the end of the 19th century, the message delivered by the Opium Wars had become unmistakable. Sovereignty in the industrial age required technological parity and fiscal flexibility. Japan's rapid modernization after 1868 underscored this lesson dramatically when it defeated China in 1895. That defeat deepened the sense that the Qing system could not evolve quickly enough to meet external challenges. The fall of the dynasty in 1911 was therefore the culmination of decades of erosion. Revolutionary sentiment drew strength from the memory of humiliation. Intellectuals and activists framed modernization as national salvation. The empire's collapse marked not the end of Chinese civilization, but the end of a political framework that had governed it for centuries. Looking back calmly, the opium trade stands as the opening chapter in this era of transformation. It exposed vulnerabilities in finance, defense, and diplomacy. It forced China into a global order defined by industrial capitalism and maritime power. It demonstrated that trade, when backed by coercion, could redraw the boundaries of sovereignty. For modern observers, the lessons remain measured and enduring. Economic interdependence can be stabilizing, but when imbalanced, it can become destabilizing. Technological advantage carries strategic implications. Institutional confidence must be matched by adaptability. The Qing Empire possessed longevity, cultural depth, and administrative sophistication, yet it confronted a century in which speed of change mattered more than inherited prestige. And so, the story resolves not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a prolonged recalibration of power. The ships that carried opium were part of a broader current sweeping across continents. In confronting that current, the Qing Empire revealed both the strengths of its tradition and the limits of its flexibility. The destruction of China's greatest empire was therefore not merely an episode of foreign aggression or domestic weakness. It was a convergence of global transformation and internal strain, catalyzed by a trade that symbolized the new age. Through it, commerce became conflict, conflict became concession, and concession reshaped the destiny of a civilization. In the quiet perspective of history, that convergence remains instructive. It reminds us that empires endure not simply through size or memory, but through adaptation to changing realities. And when adaptation lags behind transformation, even the most established powers can find themselves overtaken by the tides of a new world. As we close this long examination, it is helpful to return to the beginning, not to the first battle, nor even to the first treaty, but to the first imbalance. The Qing Empire did not initially see itself as vulnerable. It saw itself as self-sufficient. Tea, silk, and porcelain flowed outward to meet global demand. Silver flowed inward in exchange. Foreign merchants operated within tightly defined boundaries. The system appeared stable because it had been stable for generations. The opium trade disrupted that equilibrium in a way that was subtle at first. It did not arrive as an invading army. It arrived as commerce. It entered through coastal markets, through private traders, through networks that adapted quickly to prohibition. Over time, it altered monetary flows and social patterns. But its most lasting impact was structural. It exposed how dependent stability could be on assumptions about global hierarchy that were already shifting. When Britain turned to opium to balance trade, it did so within an imperial system linking Indian cultivation, London finance, and Asian shipping routes. The Qing state was not facing an isolated smuggling problem. It was confronting a coordinated economic structure backed by military power. Once enforcement escalated into armed conflict, the deeper asymmetry became visible. Industrial ships outmaneuvered older fleets. Artillery outranged traditional defenses. The outcome signaled that technological transformation had redefined leverage. The treaties that followed did more than compensate for destroyed cargo. They rewrote the framework of engagement. Ports were opened. Tariffs were constrained. Extraterritorial rights limited legal authority. Each clause narrowed the Qing court's room to maneuver. Sovereignty remained formally intact, but it operated under conditions of external oversight. Over decades, this arrangement fostered resentment and reform in equal measure. Internally, the strain manifested in multiple forms. Fiscal stress made it harder to fund disaster relief and infrastructure. Rebellions erupted in regions already grappling with demographic pressure and local grievances. Provincial armies gained prominence in restoring order, weakening centralized command. Meanwhile, foreign concessions within Chinese cities created visible reminders of constrained authority. The empire continued to function, but its coherence was thinning. Yet within that thinning structure, new ideas were taking root. Exposure to foreign legal systems and industrial methods prompted debate among scholars and officials. Reformers argued for educational overhaul, military modernization, and constitutional experimentation. The Qing court oscillated between cautious endorsement and conservative hesitation. By the early 20th century, the pace of change demanded by reformers outstripped the dynasty's capacity to control it. The fall of the Qing in 1911, therefore, appears less as an isolated revolution and more as the final stage of a prolonged transition. The opium trade had initiated the sequence by destabilizing economic balance and provoking military confrontation. Subsequent decades compounded the pressure. By the time the imperial system collapsed, its legitimacy had been eroded by repeated reminders that it could not fully defend national autonomy. In global perspective, the episode illustrates how industrialization reshaped the hierarchy of states. Control over manufacturing, shipping, and finance became decisive. Agricultural wealth alone no longer guaranteed influence. The Qing Empire's experience demonstrates how quickly prestige accumulated over centuries can be challenged when the underlying metrics of power shift. For modern audiences, the lessons are steady rather than sensational. Economic relationships are rarely neutral when disparities in technology and force are wide. Regulation without enforcement capacity invites challenge. Adaptation, though difficult, is essential when external conditions evolve rapidly. The Qing dynasty possessed resilience, cultural depth, and administrative sophistication. But resilience rooted in past stability proved insufficient in the face of accelerating global integration. And so, the story of how the opium trade destroyed China's greatest empire resolves into a broader reflection on transformation. It was not a single shipment, nor a single battle that ended dynastic rule. It was the convergence of commercial imbalance, industrial power, and institutional hesitation. Opium served as the catalyst that made this convergence visible. Through it, we see how trade can become coercion, how coercion can reshape sovereignty, and how sovereignty once diminished can trigger decades of reform and revolution. The Qing Empire's encounter with the opium trade marks the hinge between imperial continuity and modern redefinition. It stands as a reminder that the forces shaping history often begin quietly, in markets and ledgers, before revealing their full magnitude on the world stage. As we conclude this documentary in full, it is worth recognizing that the opium crisis did something rare in history. It altered not just the balance of power, but the story a civilization told about itself. For centuries, imperial China had understood its history as cyclical. Dynasties rose and fell, but the cultural and political center endured. Foreign incursions were absorbed. Internal rebellions were suppressed. Stability returned in familiar form. The 19th century broke that rhythm. The opium trade was the opening fracture. It exposed the Qing Empire to a world in which industrial production, mechanized warfare, and global finance determined influence. The old assumptions that cultural prestige guaranteed diplomatic deference, that economic self-sufficiency ensured leverage, were challenged directly. When military defeat followed economic dispute, it revealed that the metrics of power had changed. What followed was not immediate collapse but prolonged strain. The Qing state continued to govern, collect taxes, manage infrastructure, and suppress uprisings. Yet each decade after the Opium Wars layered new pressure onto weakened foundations. The Taiping Rebellion devastated central provinces. Further conflicts with foreign powers expanded treaty obligations. Indemnities strained the treasury. The Sino-Japanese War demonstrated that regional rivals could now surpass China in modernization. By the early 20th century, reform efforts were ambitious but fragmented, and revolutionary sentiment was widespread. Opium remained embedded in the collective memory as the first unmistakable signal of vulnerability. It symbolized economic exploitation backed by force. It represented a failure to adapt quickly enough to a transforming global order. Even after domestic campaigns reduced consumption and international agreements sought regulation, the narrative of humiliation endured. It became part of the ideological foundation for 20th century political movements that emphasized unity, sovereignty, and industrial strength. The fall of the Qing in 1911 therefore marked more than the end of a dynasty. It marked the end of imperial continuity as the organizing principle of Chinese governance. The republic that followed faced its own immense challenges, but it inherited a new political vocabulary shaped by the 19th century. Concepts such as constitutionalism, nationalism, and economic modernization had entered mainstream debate precisely because the Opium era had forced confrontation with global modernity. From a broader historical perspective, the episode underscores how economic strategy can reshape geopolitical realities. Britain's decision to offset a trade imbalance through opium sales was not initially conceived as a campaign to dismantle an empire. Yet, when combined with industrial military capability and diplomatic insistence on open markets, it triggered consequences that extended far beyond commerce. Trade policy became foreign policy. Foreign policy became war. War became treaty. Treaty became structural constraint. At the same time, the Qing experience illustrates that external pressure alone does not determine outcome. Internal conditions, administrative rigidity, fiscal limitations, demographic stress, interact with external shocks. It was the convergence of these factors that proved decisive. Opium accelerated exposure, but the empire's ability to respond was shaped by its own institutional framework. In calm hindsight, the destruction of China's greatest empire appears as a lesson in adaptation under duress. When the global system shifts rapidly, established powers must adjust their institutions, technologies, and diplomatic strategies accordingly. Delay compounds vulnerability. Partial reform can buy time, but without coherence and scale, it may not suffice. Yet there is also continuity in the aftermath. The resilience of Chinese society, the persistence of cultural traditions, and the eventual reassertion of sovereignty demonstrate that political forms can change while civilizational identity endures. The 19th century was a crucible, but it was not an ending. And so, the story of the opium trade and the fall of the Qing resolves into something measured and enduring. It is not merely a tale of decline, nor solely of foreign aggression. It is a case study in how commerce, technology, and power intersect at moments of global transition. Through opium, the Qing Empire encountered a new world order and found its traditional foundations insufficient. The ships that once carried opium to Chinese ports carried with them the forces of industrial modernity. In confronting those forces, the empire was transformed. Its fall marked the close of one chapter in world history and the opening of another, an era defined not by dynastic cycles, but by the complex negotiation of sovereignty in an interconnected, industrial age. That is the enduring weight of this history. A reminder that economic imbalance can ignite geopolitical change, that technological disparity can redefine diplomacy, and that even the greatest empires must evolve when the world around them changes faster than they do. As a final reflection, it is useful to consider how differently the 19th century might have unfolded if economic exchange had developed on more equal terms. Trade between China and Europe had existed for centuries without leading to war. What changed was not contact itself, but the balance of leverage behind that contact. Industrialization amplified the capacity of certain states to insist upon access, and to enforce that insistence when resisted. The opium trade became the mechanism through which that insistence first collided with Qing authority. In earlier centuries, the Qing state could manage foreign commerce by limiting it geographically and politically. Merchants were confined to specific ports, supervised by licensed intermediaries, and regulated through established routines. This system assumed that China held the stronger bargaining position. But once Britain and other powers acquired steam-powered fleets and global supply chains, the calculus shifted. Regulation without credible deterrence became vulnerable. When Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed opium in 1839, he acted within a framework that prioritized moral governance and social stability. From his perspective, protecting the population from addiction and enforcing imperial law were inseparable duties. Yet British commercial interests framed the issue as one of property rights and free trade. These conflicting interpretations of legitimacy, moral sovereignty versus commercial freedom, could not be reconciled within the diplomatic vocabulary of the time. The result was war. That war, and the treaties that followed, initiated a cycle that extended well beyond the initial dispute. Each concession signaled that pressure could yield results. Each indemnity payment strained the Qing treasury further. Each new treaty port deepened integration into a global economy not fully controlled by Beijing. By the mid-19th century, the empire was navigating a world in which its traditional tools of governance were insufficient. Still, the Qing system did not collapse immediately. It adapted where it could. Regional armies were reorganized. Modern arsenals were constructed. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched to Western capitals. The court experimented with limited constitutional reforms in its final years. These efforts reflected awareness of the scale of transformation required. But they were undertaken within an institutional culture shaped by centuries of continuity, not rapid overhaul. Over time, reformist frustration intensified. Intellectuals argued that without deeper structural change, educational modernization, representative governance, industrial expansion, China would remain vulnerable. The fall of the dynasty in 1911 represented the culmination of these debates as much as the collapse of imperial legitimacy. The opium crisis had exposed weaknesses. Subsequent decades had made those weaknesses visible to an increasingly mobilized public. From a global vantage point, the episode stands as one of the clearest examples of how economic policy can cascade into geopolitical transformation. A trade imbalance prompted a commercial solution. That solution generated social harm and legal conflict. Legal conflict escalated into military confrontation. Military defeat institutionalized inequality. Inequality fostered reform and revolution. Few historical sequences illustrate cause and effect so starkly across economic, political, and cultural domains. Yet even in this starkness, nuance remains. Not all foreign influence was destructive. Some facilitated technological and educational exchange that later proved valuable. Not all Qing officials resisted change. Many sought it actively. The tragedy lay not in contact itself, but in the asymmetry of power and timing. As we close, the enduring lesson of the opium trade's impact on the Qing Empire is not one of inevitability but of adaptation. Power structures evolve. Technologies shift. Economic networks expand. States that recognize these shifts early and respond cohesively tend to endure. Those that hesitate, constrained by internal division or overconfidence in past stability, risk being overtaken. The Qing Empire entered the 19th century as one of the world's largest and most sophisticated states. It left it transformed, its imperial structure dismantled, its political vocabulary rewritten. The opium trade did not single-handedly destroy China's greatest empire, but it was the catalyst that revealed how profoundly the world had changed. In the calm cadence of history, that is perhaps the most important insight. Commerce can carry the seeds of conflict when paired with imbalance. Technological advantage can magnify economic disputes into geopolitical crises. And even the most enduring institutions must evolve when the currents of global change gather strength. Through the lens of opium, we witness not only the fall of a dynasty, but the reshaping of a civilization's path into modernity. As we arrive at the final meditation on this history, it becomes clear that the opium crisis was as much about time as it was about trade. The Qing Empire had evolved over centuries. Its administrative habits, fiscal systems, and diplomatic assumptions were shaped gradually, refined across generations. Industrial Europe, by contrast, compressed transformation into decades. Steam engines, mechanized industry, and global shipping networks altered the tempo of power. When these two rhythms collided, the slower-moving structure struggled to adjust. The opium trade accelerated that collision. It forced the Qing court to confront industrial modernity not in theory, but in battle. Naval bombardments and treaty negotiations replaced ceremonial tribute and regulated exchange. The empire's older worldview, one in which foreign powers sought cultural recognition from the Son of Heaven, gave way to a reality in which foreign envoys demanded reciprocal diplomacy backed by gunboats. The psychological shock of this inversion lingered long after the cannons fell silent. In the decades that followed, the Qing attempted to navigate a delicate balance. On one side lay the desire to preserve moral and cultural continuity. On the other lay the recognition that survival required structural innovation. Reformers argued that Western military and industrial techniques could be adopted without sacrificing Confucian foundations. Conservatives feared that too much adaptation would unravel the social fabric. This tension slowed decisive transformation at precisely the moment when speed mattered most. The economic consequences of the opium era compounded the challenge. Indemnity payments and constrained tariffs limited fiscal maneuverability. Foreign-managed customs revenues provided stability but underscored diminished autonomy. Meanwhile, integration into global markets created new dependencies. Coastal prosperity sometimes outpaced inland recovery, widening regional disparities. The empire functioned, but unevenly. When rebellion erupted, whether in the form of the Taiping movement or later uprisings, the Qing relied on decentralized military responses. Regional commanders who raised and funded their own armies gained influence that did not easily revert to the center. Over time, this decentralization diluted imperial authority. Even successful suppression of revolt carried institutional cost. Yet the narrative of this period is not solely one of erosion. It is also one of intellectual awakening. Exposure to Western science, engineering, and political thought reshaped elite education. Students studied abroad. Newspapers circulated reformist essays. Constitutional experiments, though short-lived, signaled a willingness to reconsider the nature of governance itself. The opium crisis, painful as it was, forced China into dialogue with a changing world. By the time the Qing dynasty ended in 1911, the empire had already been transformed in structure and consciousness. The revolution did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from decades of accumulated adaptation and frustration. The opium trade had been the initial rupture, but the transformation it set in motion was broader and deeper than the commodity itself. Looking back with calm distance, the destruction of China's greatest empire appears less as a sudden downfall and more as a transition between epochs. The Qing represented the culmination of a land-based imperial tradition. The 19th century ushered in an era defined by industrial capacity and maritime reach. Opium was the conduit through which these worlds collided. The lasting significance of this history lies in its clarity. It demonstrates how economic imbalance can evolve into military confrontation. It shows how technological disparity can reshape diplomatic norms. And it reminds us that institutional confidence must be paired with adaptability when global conditions shift rapidly. Empires do not endure on memory alone. They endure by recalibrating to new realities. The Qing dynasty's encounter with the opium trade revealed how difficult that recalibration can be when transformation arrives swiftly and unevenly. Yet from that difficulty emerged a new chapter of Chinese history, one defined by reform, revolution, and the pursuit of modern sovereignty. And so the story closes where transformation began, with trade that carried more than goods, with ships that carried more than cargo. Through opium, the Qing Empire confronted a world it had not designed, and in doing so stepped, painfully and irrevocably, into modernity. In the very last measure of this story, we return to the quiet image that began it. Ships anchored off the southern coast of China, their cargo recorded in ledgers, their crews engaged in what, at first glance, appeared to be ordinary commerce. Nothing in that scene immediately suggests the end of an empire, and yet history often turns on forces that appear routine before their consequences are fully understood. The opium trade did not announce itself as a civilizational rupture. It emerged gradually from trade imbalance and imperial calculation. Britain sought to correct a silver deficit created by Europe's appetite for Chinese tea. India, under British control, produced opium efficiently. Merchants transported it through networks that blurred legality and opportunity. Profit sustained the system. Over time, however, that commercial circuit became inseparable from geopolitics. When Qing officials moved to suppress the trade, they were asserting sovereignty in a manner consistent with centuries of governance. But the world they confronted was no longer defined by regional hierarchy alone. It was defined by industrial states that interpreted open markets as strategic necessity. Once war followed, the gap in military capability revealed that industrialization had transformed not only economies but diplomacy itself. The defeat of the Qing in the Opium Wars marked the first of several shocks that would accumulate across the 19th century. Each subsequent treaty layered additional constraint. Each rebellion exposed strain within the imperial structure. Each reform effort, though significant, contended with institutional inertia and limited fiscal flexibility. The empire endured, but it endured under pressure. The long-term consequence was a shift in political imagination. Chinese thinkers began to view sovereignty not as inherited stability, but as something that required constant reinforcement through modernization. Industrial capacity, technological education, and centralized reform became associated with survival. the memory of opium, of forced concessions and constrained tariffs, remained vivid in debates about national strength. When the Qing dynasty finally fell in 1911, it was not solely because of foreign intervention, nor solely because of internal rebellion. It was because decades of compounded pressure had eroded confidence in the imperial system's ability to protect autonomy. The opium trade stands at the beginning of that erosion. It was the catalyst that revealed the scale of global transformation underway. And yet, the fall of the Qing did not signify the end of Chinese continuity. Cultural traditions persisted. Social networks endured. Intellectual life evolved. The 20th century would bring new challenges and new upheavals, but also renewed assertions of sovereignty and industrial ambition. In that sense, the destruction of the empire was also the opening of a new chapter. From the vantage point of calm historical analysis, the lesson is not dramatic but steady. Trade can become coercive when imbalances are wide. Technological innovation can shift the foundations of power faster than institutions adapt. And even long-established empires must recognize when the global context that sustained them has changed. The opium trade illustrates these dynamics with unusual clarity. It linked distant agricultural fields to naval fleets and imperial treasuries. It transformed economic dispute into armed conflict. It institutionalized inequality through treaty law. And it reshaped the trajectory of one of the world's greatest empires. So we end where history so often does, not with a single decisive moment, but with the accumulation of change. The Qing Empire did not vanish in an instant. It was gradually overtaken by forces that began in commerce and expanded into geopolitics. Through opium, the 19th century entered China with unmistakable force. And in that encounter, an empire rooted in centuries of continuity stepped into an era defined by industrial competition and global interdependence. The consequences were profound, the transformation enduring, and the lessons about power, adaptation, and the reach of trade remain relevant long after the last imperial banner was lowered. In the final quiet reflection on this history, it becomes clear that the Opium Wars were not simply an episode of conflict between China and Britain. They were a revelation of a new global order. The Qing Empire entered the 19th century confident in its administrative depth, cultural authority, and economic productivity. It exited that century without its dynasty, reshaped by forces that had gathered strength far beyond its borders. The opium trade was the hinge on which that transformation turned. It began as a calculated commercial response to trade imbalance. Britain's appetite for tea-drained silver reserves and opium cultivated in India provided a profitable counterweight. Yet what appeared as a solution within imperial accounting became a destabilizing force within China. Silver flowed outward. Addiction spread inward. Law collided with profit. Sovereignty met industrial firepower. When Qing officials attempted to halt the trade, they were defending not only public welfare but also the authority of the state. The destruction of opium stocks in 1839 symbolized a refusal to concede legal control. But the ensuing war demonstrated that industrialized states possessed tools of coercion that older empires were unprepared to resist. Naval bombardment, rapid deployment, and modern artillery forced treaty concessions that permanently altered the structure of engagement. These treaties did more than open ports. They institutionalized foreign presence. Extraterritorial courts, fixed tariffs, and indemnity payments limited policy flexibility. Over time, The accumulation of such constraints weakened confidence in the dynasty's capacity to safeguard autonomy. The Opium Wars became the first chapter in what later generations would call a century of humiliation, a narrative shaped by repeated reminders that China could be compelled from without. Yet even amid humiliation, adaptation was underway. Reform-minded officials recognized the necessity of industrial and educational modernization. Shipyards and arsenals appeared. Diplomatic missions studied Western institutions. Translation projects introduced new political vocabulary. The Qing state did not ignore the lesson of defeat. It struggled to internalize it within a deeply rooted imperial framework. The difficulty lay in scale and speed. Industrialization required sustained investment and unified direction. Internal rebellions and fiscal strain fragmented resources. Regional commanders gained prominence, diluting central control. Court factions debated the extent of reform. By the time more ambitious transformation was attempted, revolutionary energy had overtaken incremental change. The fall of the Qing in 1911 thus reflected decades of cumulative strain. Opium was not the sole cause, but it was the catalyst that revealed how rapidly the world was changing. It connected economic imbalance to military vulnerability. It exposed technological disparity. It forced China into an international system governed increasingly by industrial capitalism and legal standardization. From a global perspective, the episode illustrates how trade can become a lever of influence when backed by superior force. It shows how economic instruments can reshape political sovereignty. And it underscores how empires rooted in one historical context must adapt swiftly when that context shifts. At the same time, the story does not end in disappearance. The collapse of the Qing dynasty opened space for new political experiments, new ideologies, and renewed determination to modernize. The memory of the Opium era shaped 20th century priorities: industrial growth, centralized authority, and vigilance against external dependency. The trauma of the 19th century became part of the foundation for modern Chinese statecraft. In calm retrospect, the destruction of China's greatest empire appears as a transition rather than a finality. The Qing represented the culmination of a land-based imperial tradition. The 19th century ushered in an era defined by steam power, global finance, and maritime reach. Opium was the conduit through which these worlds collided. And so we close with a steady understanding. History does not turn only on armies or proclamations. It turns on trade routes, balance sheets, and technological change. The opium trade carried with it the momentum of industrial modernity. In confronting it, the Qing Empire encountered a new measure of power and found that the old equilibrium could not hold. Through that encounter, an empire ended and a new chapter began. The lessons of that transformation, about adaptation, sovereignty, and the far-reaching consequences of commerce, continue to echo long after the smoke of the Opium Wars has faded into history.